It is said that the Vatican holds the single most complete record of Western civilization. But here is the shock that few dare to whisper aloud. 90% of its archives remain sealed, forbidden even to scholars with the highest credentials. 53 miles of shelving, stretching like veins beneath Rome, packed with papal decrees, erased manuscripts, financial ledgers, visions, prophecies, hidden from the world. What kind of truths require such silence? What history has been rewritten? What discoveries erased? What futures denied to us so that power might endure? Imagine wars waged not only on battlefields, but in locked vaults. Imagine miracles edited like manuscripts. Imagine secrets so destabilizing they were buried for centuries. These are not fantasies. They are fragments, glimpses, revelations pried loose from the Vatican itself. Clues that suggest the story of civilization as we know it may be incomplete by design. So tonight, let us open that forbidden door together. Step softly into corridors where the dust of centuries clings to hidden pages, where archivists in shadow guard the silence, and where every lock hints at truths too dangerous to be told. Welcome to the labyrinth of the Vatican Secret Archives. Would you dare to follow? At the heart of Vatican City stands a door that most of the world will never pass. It is not marked with grandeur nor framed by gilded arches. In fact, its plain facade is part of its power. Behind it lies one of the most tightly restricted collections of documents on Earth, the Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019. The name may have changed, but the reality has not. This door opens to 85 kilometers of shelving, holding more than 35 million items, correspondence, papal bulls, treaties, inquisitorial records, maps and manuscripts. And of that staggering collection, scholars have been allowed to see less than 10%. The term secret in its original Latin meant private, belonging to the Pope alone. But over centuries, the aura of the word evolved. It became associated with concealment, mystery, and forbidden knowledge. The Vatican has tried to soften that connotation by rebranding, yet the essence remains. These archives are closed to almost everyone. They are not a public resource like a national library. They are a vault of curated memory, guarded by rules as strict as any intelligence agency. To understand why this locked door matters, one must consider the scope of what it hides. Within the archive's walls are documents chronicling nearly every major political, scientific, and cultural event in Europe since the 12th century. From papal correspondence with emperors to records of early banking arrangements, from treaties that shaped kingdoms to trial transcripts that silenced scientists. The archive is less a passive storehouse than a control mechanism. By deciding what survives and what is accessible, the Vatican has influenced not just religious history, but the very narrative of Western civilization. Access is tightly restricted. Scholars must apply with specific credentials and must state in advance the exact document they wish to consult. Browsing is forbidden. If you do not know that a document exists, you cannot ask for it. And even if you can identify it, the decision to allow access remains with the archivists, who act under authority of the Pope. The result is a system that allows the Church to manage historical inquiry itself. What is seen can be debated. What is withheld effectively ceases to exist in public consciousness. Occasionally, fragments are released, and their impact is immediate. When the Galileo files were partially opened in the 1980s, historians were forced to revise their understanding of how deliberately and systematically the Church opposed heliocentrism. When wartime financial documents were disclosed in the 2010s, evidence emerged of Vatican connections to Nazi assets. Each revelation has raised the same question. If this is what has been hidden, what remains? The physical scale of the archives reinforces the mystery. 85 kilometers of shelving would stretch from Vatican City deep into the Italian countryside. The chambers are climate-controlled, some built underground, others sealed with advanced security systems. Even the catalogues themselves are partially restricted. Scholars cannot freely view indexes that list what is inside. In some cases, the very existence of a manuscript is treated as classified information. Scientific imaging has added another layer of intrigue. Manuscripts long thought to be blank or damaged have been shown, under multispectral light, to conceal older writings. Palimpsests, pages scraped and overwritten, reveal fragments of erased histories. Some hold alternative versions of church councils, others contain notes of experiments, astronomical observations, or financial dealings. Each discovery suggests that what we see is only a fraction of what once was, and that erasure itself was part of the Vatican's strategy of control. Historians point to a striking statistical problem. If the archive holds 35 million items and less than 10% have ever been examined by outsiders, then our understanding of European history rests on a sample too small to be reliable. Imagine reconstructing the story of a civilization from only a tenth of its documents, chosen not by impartial archivists, but by an institution with vested interests in its own authority. This is the reality of our historical record. The locked door in Rome is therefore not just a physical threshold. It is a symbol of the imbalance between what humanity knows and what it is prevented from knowing. Behind it lie records of coronations and excommunications, condemnations of heretics, and instructions to missionaries. There are maps of lands claimed before explorers arrived, letters exchanged with kings before wars were declared, financial ledgers documenting wealth that shifted the balance of empires. Each is a piece of a puzzle, withheld from the larger picture. What makes the archives especially potent is the pattern of release. When documents are eventually opened, it is rarely voluntary transparency. It is usually the result of pressure, scholars demanding access, scandals forcing disclosure, anniversaries requiring symbolic gestures. And when those documents surface, they invariably alter accepted history. The suppression of science appears more deliberate. The Vatican's financial entanglements appear more extensive. The manipulation of prophecy appears more strategic. Every release confirms what critics have long suspected. The secrecy is not about preservation, but about control. The mystery is compounded by what remains unacknowledged. For centuries, historians have noted the documentary lacuna, a gap in Vatican records from the 9th to 11th centuries. These were pivotal centuries in European development. The rise of the Holy Roman Empire, the flowering of Islamic scholarship, the consolidation of papal authority. Yet Vatican holdings from this period are conspicuously sparse. The official explanation invokes loss from wars, raids, or decay. But skeptics argue that the selectivity of survival points to intentional removal, erasing inconvenient narratives that might contradict papal claims of supremacy. In this light, the locked door does not merely protect documents, it protects the Vatican's version of history. Every parchment sealed away strengthens the institution's ability to decide what humanity remembers and what it forgets. The forbidden truths, then, are not confined to scandalous details about popes or kings. They encompass the broader manipulation of collective memory. When Pope Francis rebranded the archives in 2019, calling them the Apostolic Archives, he insisted that secrecy was misunderstood. The renaming was meant to promote transparency, but critics noted the irony. While the name changed, access did not. The locked door remains. The rules remain. The forbidden 90% remain forbidden. The gesture only highlights the persistence of control. The locked door in Rome becomes the first image of our journey, not a metaphor invented by poets, but a physical reality, a guarded entrance, a restricted vault, a silence that has lasted 8 centuries. It is here, at this threshold, that the story of the Vatican's forbidden truths begins. It is here we recognize that secrecy is not a relic of the past. It is an ongoing practice, shaping what we think we know about history and what we never will. The year 1198 marked a decisive turning point in the history of the papacy and in the origins of what we now call the Vatican Secret Archives. Innocent III, who ascended to the papal throne in that year, was no ordinary pontiff. He was one of the most politically astute leaders of medieval Europe, a man whose vision of papal supremacy extended far beyond theology. He understood that power was not only exercised on battlefields or in cathedrals, but also in records, contracts, decrees, letters, and legal decisions. By centralizing and carefully preserving these documents, he gave the papacy a new weapon: control of memory. The practice of archiving papal documents was not new in itself. Earlier popes had maintained collections of correspondence and decrees, but Innocent III systematized it, making record-keeping part of the machinery of papal government. He ordered that all papal bulls, formal decrees sealed with lead, be copied and filed. Diplomatic exchanges with monarchs were preserved. Financial arrangements with Italian banking families and Venetian merchants were recorded in ledgers. The result was the earliest structure of what became the Vatican Secret Archives, not a library of devotion, but a repository of political and financial power. One cannot understand the archives without grasping the extraordinary reach of Innocent III's papacy. He claimed authority over emperors, intervened in disputes between kings, and asserted that the Pope was the rightful arbiter of all Christian society. To enforce these claims, he needed evidence, documents proving promises made, oaths sworn, and territories conceded. The archives became both proof and leverage. A forgotten treaty could be produced decades later to enforce papal rights. A record of correspondence could be used to remind rulers of their obligations. In an age when memory was fragile and parchment rare, the ability to store and retrieve written evidence gave the Pope unparalleled influence. Yet, when we examine the earlier centuries of papal record-keeping, we encounter something deeply unsettling: the documentary lacuna. This is the name historians give to a puzzling gap in the archival record between roughly 800 and 1100 CE. These 3 centuries were among the most transformative in Europe. They saw the coronation of Charlemagne and the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, the flourishing of Islamic scholarship in Spain, the rise of new financial systems, and the spread of monastic reforms that reshaped Christian spirituality. But in the Vatican's holdings, authentic records from this period are remarkably scarce. The official explanation points to chaos: Viking raids that destroyed monasteries, political instability that interrupted record-keeping, and the natural decay of parchment. Yet these arguments become harder to sustain when we realize that other institutions preserved documents from the same period. Monasteries in France and England, Byzantine libraries, even Islamic scholars in Spain kept records that survived the centuries. Why then would the papacy, the institution that prided itself on universality, lose so much of its own past? Skeptics argue that the lacuna reflects not accidental loss, but intentional erasure. The gap coincides with moments when papal authority was still fragile, contested by emperors, bishops, and rival claimants. To present the 12th and 13th centuries as the natural flowering of papal supremacy, earlier ambiguities may have been removed. The absence itself becomes a narrative. By skipping over centuries of struggle and uncertainty, the Vatican could frame its power as inevitable, continuous, divinely ordained. Evidence of selective preservation supports this view. While records of doctrinal decrees survive, far fewer political documents remain. Treaties acknowledging papal ownership of lands are present, but correspondence that might question or undermine those claims is missing. In the same centuries, documents supporting theological supremacy are preserved, while those complicating the story of papal expansion are absent. The pattern is too consistent to be chance. We can see the implications in later centuries. By the time Innocent III compiled his archives, he could present them as evidence of papal supremacy rooted in history. Bulls and treaties aligned to create a paper trail of authority. What was omitted was just as powerful as what was included. The archive did not simply reflect reality, it reshaped it. Scientific tools now allow us to study these gaps in new ways. Paleographers analysing handwriting styles in the surviving manuscripts have identified abrupt changes, suggesting that older documents may have been recopied selectively. Radiocarbon dating of parchment sometimes reveals inconsistencies between the age of the material and the date of the text it carries, possible signs of later tampering. Multispectral imaging has exposed faint traces of erased writing on certain leaves, revealing that original texts were scraped away and overwritten with more favourable versions. Take, for example, the fragments of correspondence between early medieval popes and Byzantine emperors. Where one might expect detailed negotiations over power, we find only brief formulaic exchanges. Yet under multispectral light, erased lines reveal hints of disputes, concessions, and agreements that paint a far less triumphant picture of papal influence. Such glimpses confirm what the lacuna suggests, that the early history of papal authority was more complex and perhaps more precarious than the official record allows. The significance of this is profound. It means that from its very inception, the archive was not merely about preservation, but about construction. By curating memory, Innocent III and his successors created the impression of a papacy destined to rule. The documents chosen to survive were those that reinforced continuity. The documents erased or omitted were those that revealed fragility. This origin story explains why the Vatican Secret Archives are so tightly guarded today. To open them fully would not simply reveal hidden details. It might unravel the narrative of papal supremacy that has been built across centuries. The lacuna and its silences remind us that history as we know it may be as carefully edited as any manuscript. The locked door in Rome thus conceals not only the secrets of others, kings, scientists, bankers, but the secrets of the Church itself. From the beginning, the Vatican's empire was founded not just on theology or armies, but on control of information. What was written, preserved, and presented became the foundation of legitimacy. What was erased was consigned to oblivion. The origins of a hidden empire are not simply about one pope's reforms. They are about the recognition that knowledge itself is the truest form of power. The Vatican understood this earlier and more thoroughly than any other institution in Europe. Its archives became the engine of that power, shaping both the past remembered and the future imagined. In the autumn of 1632, Galileo Galilei faced the full weight of the Roman Inquisition. At nearly 70 years old, frail and suffering from illness, he was brought to trial for advocating a theory that we now take for granted, that the Earth orbits the Sun. To later generations, his case came to symbolize the struggle between science and dogma. But the details preserved, some released only in fragments from the Vatican Secret Archives, show that Galileo's condemnation was not a simple theological dispute. It was part of a deliberate strategy by the Vatican to control knowledge that threatened its authority. Galileo's central claim, heliocentrism, directly contradicted the geocentric model long tied to church doctrine. But the deeper issue was what acceptance of heliocentrism implied. If the Earth was not the centre of the universe, then humanity itself was not the focal point of divine creation. And if humanity was not central, then the Church's role as mediator between God and man lost its cosmic justification. The danger, in Vatican eyes, was not astronomy, it was philosophy. The trial documents confirm this. Letters between cardinals, preserved in the archives but withheld from scholars until the late 20th century, discuss how Galileo's ideas would unravel the harmony of the cosmos and weaken the hierarchy of the Church. These were not theological arguments but political calculations. The concern was clear. To admit the Earth moved was to admit the papacy did not occupy the immovable centre of human destiny. Galileo's own dialogue. Concerning the two chief world systems used vivid language to demonstrate the superiority of the heliocentric model. He presented his arguments as a conversation among three characters, giving the Copernican position the voice of reason. The Church's reaction was swift and severe. His book was banned, and he was summoned to Rome. Yet within the archives lie indications that the ban was not only about the content, but also about the method. By presenting heliocentrism in accessible dialogue, Galileo threatened to make dangerous knowledge available to the educated public beyond the control of theologians. Beyond Galileo's case, the archives reveal a broader system of suppression. Records of the Congregation of the Index, the body responsible for censoring books, show hundreds of titles banned during this period, not only astronomical treatises, but works of medicine, philosophy, and natural history. Many of these books have since been lost, their disappearance ensuring that Galileo appears as a singular case when in truth he was only the most famous. For every Galileo, there were dozens of lesser-known scholars silenced without record. The Vatican's role in this suppression is underscored by the existence of what some scholars call the inquisitorial dossiers. These files, still largely closed, contain reports of manuscripts confiscated from private libraries, experimental notes seized from natural philosophers, and correspondence intercepted between scientists across Europe. Occasional references that have leaked suggest that the Vatican maintained an active surveillance network, monitoring the flow of ideas that might destabilize doctrine. Scientific imaging has allowed us to glimpse a few of these hidden texts. Manuscripts once dismissed as damaged have, under multispectral analysis, revealed erased notes about planetary observations, experimental descriptions of pendulums, and hypotheses about magnetism. In some cases, the erased material predates Galileo, showing that heliocentric ideas and natural philosophy had wider circulation than once thought. The Vatican's effort was not merely to suppress Galileo, but to erase a lineage of inquiry. The forbidden truth here is that the Vatican recognized knowledge as a form of power that rivaled its own. The Church was not naive. It understood the implications of empirical science. Accepting heliocentrism meant rethinking the place of scripture, tradition, and authority. The archives show this clearly in memoranda describing how natural philosophy, if unchecked, will erode the obedience of the faithful. The suppression was strategic, not accidental. Even the trial itself illustrates the machinery of control. Galileo was not executed, as many later imagined, but he was forced to recant under threat of torture. He spent the remainder of his life under house arrest, forbidden to publish. His works were placed on the index, ensuring that they could not be circulated without permission. Yet even here, the archives reveal duplicity. Copies of his writings continued to circulate privately within the Vatican. Cardinals and popes studied them even as they were condemned publicly. The knowledge was too valuable to destroy, but too dangerous to release. The motif of the locked door reappears here as the telescope lens. Galileo's telescope opened a new window to the heavens, the moons of Jupiter orbiting a planet, the phases of Venus, the rough surface of the moon. Each observation chipped away at the geocentric model. Yet the Vatican's reaction was to close that window, to declare that what was seen must not be believed. The telescope became not only a scientific tool, but a forbidden object, a device that threatened the carefully constructed cosmos of authority. Centuries later, in 1992, the Church formally acknowledged its error in condemning Galileo. But even this rehabilitation raises questions. If the trial was simply an unfortunate misunderstanding, why do many of the trial transcripts remain sealed? Why are researchers still denied access to the full proceedings of Galileo's interrogations? The Vatican's continuing secrecy suggests that the trial contains details more revealing than the sanitized story of dogma versus science. It suggests that the archives preserve evidence of a systematic effort to suppress knowledge, one that extended far beyond Galileo and continued for centuries. The case of Galileo forces us to recognize the archive not as a neutral collection, but as a fortress of curated memory. What was permitted to survive was not necessarily what was true, but what was useful. And what was suppressed was not always false, but often dangerous to authority. In the heavens, Galileo saw moons and planets. In Rome, the Church saw the collapse of its cosmic centrality. The The forbidden truth is not simply that Galileo suffered, it is that his suffering was part of a larger machinery, an intentional effort by one of the world's most powerful institutions to control the limits of human knowledge. The Vatican did not fear error, it feared freedom, and in the silence of its vaults, the echoes of that suppression remain. On October 13, 1307, in one of the most coordinated arrests in medieval history, the Knights Templar were seized across France by order of King Philip IV. The charges were sensational: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, even secret rituals involving spitting on the cross. Chroniclers record the shock that swept through Europe. The Templars had been celebrated as warrior monks, protectors of pilgrims, and veterans of the Crusades. Now, in a single dawn, they were accused of being enemies of Christ. The standard history taught for centuries was that the order was dissolved and its leaders executed, its vast wealth seized by the crown. Yet the documents preserved in the Vatican Secret Archives, many hidden for 700 years, suggest a different story, one of survival, absorption, and transformation. The Knights Templar were more than a military brotherhood. They had become the most advanced financial organization in Europe. They pioneered the use of letters of credit, enabling merchants and pilgrims to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them in another, safeguarded by Templar authority. They managed estates, lent money to kings, and developed a network of fortresses that doubled as treasuries. Their financial innovations were centuries ahead of their time. To rulers like Philip IV, perpetually in debt to them, this made the order both indispensable and dangerous. In 2001, Vatican archivists rediscovered the Chinon parchment, a document misplaced in the stacks for centuries. It recorded that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. In other words, the Pope did not believe the charges brought by Philip IV. The parchment remained hidden until it was made public in 2007, dramatically altering our understanding of the episode. Far from condemning the Templars, the papacy seems to have shielded them in secret, even as it allowed their public destruction. What do you think? Were the Templars truly destroyed, or did they survive in another form, hidden within the Church? Why maintain this double narrative? The answer lies in the balance of power. Philip IV was determined to dismantle the Templars and seize their resources. To resist him openly would have plunged the papacy into direct conflict with the French crown at a time when its own authority was fragile. By supporting Philip publicly while absolving the Templars privately, the Vatican protected its own interests. The Templar order was dissolved on paper, but its expertise and networks did not simply vanish. Financial records from the decades following 1307 reveal uncanny continuities. Practices once exclusive to the Templars, international transfers of credit, complex bookkeeping, and discreet lending, appear in Vatican accounts. Within a generation, papal finances displayed methods that took the Templars 2 centuries to refine. The sudden adoption suggests transfer rather than invention. The men who once managed Templar ledgers may well have found employment in papal institutions, their skills too valuable to waste. Architectural evidence supports this continuity. Churches and chapels built under papal commission in the 14th and 15th centuries incorporate unmistakable Templar motifs: octagonal floor plans, symbolic carvings, and hidden chambers. The Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, though built later in the mid-15th century, contains a profusion of Templar iconography, crosses, stars, and cryptic carvings. While often attributed to legend, the consistency of such designs across Europe suggests a shared lineage, one that continued under the aegis of the Church. Some of the most intriguing clues lie in maps and manuscripts preserved in the archives. Certain Portolan charts, detailed maritime maps, contain notations linked to Templar symbols. Historians debate whether these reflect voyages conducted by the order, possibly even before the age of exploration. If so, their knowledge may have been absorbed into Vatican collections, hidden away, as the Church directed navigation and missionary expansion in later centuries. The motif of the locked door here takes the form of the sealed vault. It is no coincidence that soon after the Templars' suppression, papal archives expand significantly. Records of financial transactions, property management, and banking appear with sudden sophistication. The silence about the Templars in these new records is itself telling. Their absence is too complete, their erasure too deliberate. It suggests not extinction, but transformation. Knowledge folded into the Vatican's machinery. The public myth of destruction concealing a private continuity. Modern techniques of manuscript analysis add weight to this interpretation. Under ultraviolet and multispectral light, scholars have detected erased entries in Vatican account books, where names of certain institutions were scraped away and replaced with new ones. In some cases, the handwriting styles match those known from Templar clerks. These subtle traces hint at a quiet rebranding of the order's assets, a transfer disguised as annihilation. The forbidden truth, then, is that the Templars may never have disappeared. They were not eradicated, but absorbed into papal finances, architecture, and institutions. By declaring their dissolution, the Vatican and Philip IV eliminated a rival while simultaneously inheriting its infrastructure. The archive preserves this dual story, one of suppression for public consumption and one of continuity hidden in ledgers, maps, and stones. This reframing forces us to reconsider centuries of history. If the Templars survived within Vatican structures, then the Church's later power in banking, politics, and even exploration may rest on foundations laid by the order it claimed to destroy. The myths of treasure ships vanishing into the Atlantic or secret knowledge buried in ruins may be less important than the reality of institutional absorption. The treasure was not lost, it was catalogued. The knowledge was not burned, it was sealed in the archive. And so the Templar disappearance becomes less a story of execution and more a story of concealment. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, the traces of an order that once rivaled kings were folded into a larger empire of memory and control. In March 1944, as Allied forces pressed toward Rome and the Nazi occupation began to collapse, a different kind of struggle unfolded inside Vatican walls. While much of Europe was consumed by fire and ruin, the Vatican managed vast networks of financial assets, some of which had been quietly tied to the fortunes of fascist regimes. What later emerged from the Vatican Secret Archives and accompanying financial records challenges the official narrative of neutrality. It reveals a more complex, troubling picture, the Holy See as both silent witness and discreet banker. The foundation of this financial role was laid 2 years earlier with the creation of the Institute for the Works of Religion, better known as the Vatican Bank. Established in 1942, at the height of global conflict, it was not bound by the regulations that governed ordinary financial institutions. Because it operated under the sovereignty of the Vatican city-state, it could move money without oversight from national governments or international auditors. This gave it a unique ability to channel funds across borders at a time when most transactions were tightly monitored by warring states. The scale of what passed through the Vatican remains staggering. Gold looted by the Nazis from occupied territories, especially from central banks and Jewish families, was laundered through accounts held in the Vatican Bank. Once deposited, these assets were quickly shifted into Swiss accounts, converted into investment portfolios, or disguised as religious donations. The euphemism, assets for the preservation of Christendom, appears in some of the surviving ledgers, masking what was in fact the recycling of plundered wealth. Declassified documents and investigations by institutions such as the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, have provided fragments of the picture. One OSS report from 1945 referred to a flow of Nazi gold through Vatican channels, estimating the value in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Later research, including studies conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, confirmed that shipments of gold from the Reichsbank in Berlin to Switzerland often included a stop at the Vatican Bank. These findings match what limited archival access has since verified, that the Vatican served as a trusted intermediary, providing both discretion and moral cover. The rat lines, long associated with the escape of Nazi officials to South America, were not only about moving people. Financial records indicate they were also about moving money. Priests and Catholic institutions in Spain, Croatia, and Argentina acted as conduits, using church properties and charities to conceal cash, artworks, and bullion. Survivors' testimonies and investigative commissions later pointed to warehouses and monasteries where looted goods were temporarily stored before being sold or transferred. The Vatican's role in authorizing, or at least tolerating these movements, is evident in correspondence held in its archives. One striking example involves the Ustaše regime in Croatia, a fascist government responsible for horrific atrocities. After its collapse in 1945, members of the regime fled with gold stolen from victims. Documents released in 1997 suggest that at least some of this treasure was transferred through the Vatican Bank before reappearing in accounts in South America. While the Vatican has never admitted complicity, the financial trails suggest otherwise. The pattern that emerges is one of systematic laundering. Stolen assets were rarely kept in Vatican hands for long. Instead, they passed quickly through, transformed in the process from tainted property into legitimate funds. This sleight of hand was not only financial but moral. By classifying the transfers as religious contributions or humanitarian aid, the Vatican gave them an aura of sanctity. The reality was more complex. Genocide funded political survival, and stolen wealth was used to establish financial structures that remain active today. The forbidden truth, revealed through pieced-together evidence, is that the Vatican's wartime role cannot be described simply as passive or neutral. It actively facilitated transactions that preserved fascist fortunes, ensuring those involved could rebuild lives after the war. The archives preserve coded correspondence referring to discrete allocations, special contributions, and assets in transit. Each phrase hides the suffering of those from whom the wealth was taken. The secrecy extended far beyond the war years. For decades, the Vatican denied any involvement in Nazi finances. Yet the opening of limited files in the early 21st century contradicted these claims. The pattern of denial followed by reluctant admission mirrors earlier episodes. Silence during Galileo's trial, evasions about the Templars, and delayed acknowledgement of political manipulations like Fatima. The machinery of control extended into the modern financial age. Scientific methods have helped uncover traces of this hidden story. Forensic analysis of gold bars in Swiss banks has identified serial numbers tracing them back to the Reichsbank, with some shipments documented as passing through Vatican channels. Archival imaging of Vatican ledgers has revealed erased entries, numbers scraped off and replaced with new figures, suggesting efforts to conceal original amounts. Even infrared scans of correspondence have uncovered faint notes in margins, recording transactions in ways not intended for public view. The consequences of these wartime activities were far-reaching. By enabling Nazi wealth to survive, the Vatican inadvertently or deliberately helped seed post-war networks of power. Former officials fleeing to South America used their resources to establish businesses, political movements, and clandestine organizations. Meanwhile, within Europe, Vatican-managed investments provided capital for post-war reconstruction projects that aligned with church interests. The motif of the locked door here becomes the sealed vault. Behind the facade of marble and ritual, underground chambers housed records of financial flows that shaped the outcome of war and the configuration of peace. The vaults guarded not only gold, but the secrets of who benefited from its transfer. The Vatican's sovereignty ensured immunity, while its religious status provided plausible deniability. The forbidden truth is that Vatican neutrality was never truly neutral. It was transactional. Silence about atrocities bought protection for institutions. Facilitation of wealth flows secured future influence. By appearing to stand above politics, the Vatican positioned itself to profit from all sides, ensuring survival regardless of outcome. When limited documents were released in 2019, they confirmed decades of suspicion. The files spoke of arrangements with industrialists, bankers, and political figures, some redacted even in modern publications. They showed that the Vatican's financial operations were part of a larger, long-standing pattern of serving as a discreet intermediary in global conflicts. The gold of the Second World War did not vanish. It was converted, catalogued, and circulated. The victims who once owned it were silenced, but the wealth lived on, woven into the foundations of post-war banking and politics. The Vatican's role in this process remains one of the most troubling legacies preserved behind its locked doors. As with earlier eras, the secrecy itself tells the story. What we know comes only from fragments reluctantly released. What remains sealed may reveal far greater entanglements, connecting the Church not only to wartime profiteering, but to the structures of modern finance that still influence nations today. And yet, the story of secrecy does not end in 1945. As the guns of war fell silent and Europe rebuilt, a new struggle emerged, not of tanks and bombs, but of ideologies. In the shadow of the Cold War, the Vatican once again positioned itself as a decisive player, this time not through gold shipments, but through alliances with intelligence networks. The door of the archive closes on the Nazi era, only to open onto the covert concordats of the Cold War. In the years immediately following 1945, Europe stood on the edge of a new kind of conflict. Cities lay in ruins, empires collapsed, and the map of the continent was redrawn not only by treaties but by ideologies. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers, and in between them stood the Catholic Church. Having navigated the chaos of the Second World War, the Vatican now faced a different battle: communism. This was not only a political enemy, but, in the eyes of the Church, a spiritual one, an ideology that denied God, dismissed religion, and threatened to dismantle centuries of influence. The Vatican did not confront this threat alone. Documents now partially accessible through declassified Western intelligence files, alongside fragments of Vatican correspondence, reveal a deep partnership with American and NATO intelligence services. The relationship was pragmatic. For Washington, the Vatican represented a global network of influence trusted by millions, with reach into communities that governments could never penetrate. For the Vatican, American resources and intelligence offered protection against the spread of communist regimes in Europe and beyond. The collaboration was not limited to diplomacy. Operation Gladio, the clandestine NATO program designed to prevent communist parties from gaining power in Western Europe, depended heavily on Catholic infrastructure. Secret stay-behind armies were funded and supplied, often with the cooperation of local church leaders. Catholic organizations provided logistical support, safe houses, and communication channels. The Vatican's financial institutions helped launder funds, disguising covert transfers as charitable donations or missionary aid. This is not speculation. It is attested in fragments of correspondence preserved in both NATO archives and Vatican files. The forbidden truth is that the Church, long presented as a neutral spiritual authority, was deeply embedded in covert political operations. One revealing detail appears in US intelligence memos from the late 1940s describing Catholic Action, a lay movement promoted by the Vatican. Officially dedicated to spreading Christian values, it became, in practice, a vehicle for mobilizing voters against communist candidates in Italy and France. Funding routed through Vatican channels ensured that political messaging could be disguised as religious outreach. Sermons became campaign speeches, schools became training grounds, and charities became fronts for distributing resources to anti-communist groups. Operation Splendor, less well known than Gladio, extended this influence into the United States itself. Declassified CIA documents from the 1950s describe how Catholic institutions within America were encouraged, and sometimes covertly financed, to shape public opinion. Catholic schools taught curricula emphasizing the dangers of atheism and the sanctity of democracy. Catholic newspapers and radio programs received subsidies through intermediaries connected to Vatican financial networks. Even liturgical themes, according to some reports, were coordinated to reinforce loyalty to Western policy objectives. The Vatican Secret Archives hold traces of this cooperation, though most remain sealed. The fragments that have surfaced suggest detailed coordination at the highest levels. Papal advisors exchanged letters with US officials not only about theological matters, but about election strategies, labor movements, and propaganda techniques. Some files reference psychological studies conducted jointly by Catholic scholars and intelligence agencies, examining how religious symbolism could be used to trigger emotional responses. The use of saints, sacraments, and Marian devotion in political messaging was not accidental. It was carefully calculated. Scientific analysis of the surviving documents adds weight to this story. Multispectral imaging of certain typewritten memos has revealed faint annotations erased or overwritten. Marginal notes referring to funding sources, code names, and instructions for integration with NATO objectives. Linguistic analysis of speeches from the period shows striking parallels between Vatican homilies and CIA talking points, suggesting a deliberate synchronization of messages. This is not conspiracy theory, but the outcome of forensic methods applied to historical texts. The motif of the locked door here is the closed meeting room, where clergy and intelligence officers sat together to plan not only spiritual campaigns, but covert operations. Behind these doors, ideological warfare was crafted with the same precision as liturgy. And just as the archives preserved theological decrees for centuries, they also recorded these clandestine concordats, locking them away to maintain the illusion of separation between altar and state. The consequences of this partnership were profound. In Italy, the Vatican's mobilization of Catholic voters was decisive in preventing communist electoral victories in 1948 and beyond. In Latin America, the same networks later supported anti-communist regimes, sometimes aligning the Church with authoritarian governments. In Eastern Europe, Catholic institutions acted as intelligence-gathering channels, passing information about local conditions back to the West. The Vatican's global reach became a tool in the ideological struggle, extending far beyond its religious mission. But the price of this involvement was high. By merging its authority with covert operations, the Church blurred the line between spiritual mission and political manipulation. Believers who thought they were receiving divine guidance were, at times, participating in carefully designed campaigns orchestrated with secular intelligence agencies. Faith became weaponized, sermons became instruments of policy, and the pulpit became a platform for Cold War strategy. This dual role remains one of the most controversial aspects of Vatican history. Officially, the Church has maintained that it was acting to protect freedom and defend the faithful against atheistic oppression. Yet the documents that trickle out of the archives tell a more complex story. They reveal a Vatican willing to engage in deception, covert funding, and psychological manipulation to preserve influence. The methods echo earlier centuries of information control, but now applied in the context of modern geopolitics. The forbidden truth is that the Vatican's Cold War activities were not exceptional aberrations. They were the continuation of a centuries-old strategy, using information, secrecy, and influence to shape outcomes beyond the reach of open debate. The machinery that once censored Galileo's telescope or erased Templar ledgers now operated in the age of radio broadcasts, covert funding, and psychological warfare. The form changed, but the principle remained the same. As the Cold War deepened, this collaboration became institutionalized. The networks established in the 1950s and 1960s provided the foundation for ongoing ties between Catholic organizations and intelligence agencies. References to these networks appear in declassified CIA files, sometimes under innocuous labels, sometimes redacted entirely. Within the Vatican's own files, many remain locked, classified under headings that reveal nothing. The silence is telling. And so, the Cold War concordats remind us that the Vatican Secret Archives are not only about the distant past. They hold the keys to understanding the modern world, the shaping of democratic outcomes, the manipulation of public opinion, the merging of sacred authority with covert power. What began as financial laundering during the Second World War evolved seamlessly into psychological and political warfare in the decades that followed. The locked door did not close in 1945. It opened onto a new labyrinth, one in which religion, intelligence, and ideology became indistinguishable. Yet covert concordats were not the only weapon. Alongside secret funds and clandestine meetings, another instrument proved just as powerful: prophecy. When faith alone could not mobilize millions, visions of the divine could. No example captures this more than the apparitions at Fatima. What began as the testimony of 3 shepherd children in Portugal soon became a tool wielded in the Cold War itself. And within the Vatican archives, the records of Fatima, its secrets, its contradictions, its silences, remain among the most tightly guarded. To understand how belief itself was shaped into strategy, we must turn now to those visions and the paradox they still cast over the 20th century. On May 13, 1917, in a small Portuguese village called Fatima, 3 children, Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Jacinta and Francisco Marto, claimed to have seen a lady brighter than the sun. She spoke with them, urged prayer, and promised to return. Over the months that followed, the children reported 6 apparitions in total. Each time the crowds grew larger, culminating in October when tens of thousands gathered and reported seeing what came to be known as the miracle of the sun. Witnesses described the sun spinning, changing colours, and plunging toward the earth before resuming its place in the sky. For believers, it was proof of divine intervention. For skeptics, it was mass hysteria or an atmospheric event. But for the Vatican, Fatima was something far more practical: an opportunity. The children eventually relayed 3 secrets given by the apparition. The first was a vision of hell, with souls tormented in fire. The second was a prediction that another war would come if the world did not repent, accompanied by the rise of Russia spreading its errors. The third was kept hidden by the Vatican for decades, fueling speculation that it contained an apocalyptic prophecy too dangerous to reveal. The official story, carefully managed by the Church, presents these secrets as divine guidance. Yet archival fragments and independent testimonies suggest the story was shaped from the very beginning. Vatican investigators were dispatched almost immediately after the events, questioning the children and recording their answers. Surviving drafts show subtle but important edits. Where the children spoke in vague, childlike terms, officials inserted theological precision. Words like Immaculate Heart and conversion of Russia do not resemble the speech of uneducated rural children. Scholars who have examined early notes argue that the Vatican guided the testimonies into alignment with its political needs. The second secret, with its focus on Russia, proved particularly useful during the Cold War. Sermons across Europe cited it as proof that communism was condemned not just by popes, but by heaven itself. The Vatican and Western governments alike amplified Fatima as a religious counterpoint to Soviet atheism. Within the archives are references to coordinated media campaigns, pamphlets, films, and rallies built around the theme of Fatima as divine resistance to communism. CIA documents declassified in the early 2000s even reference Fatima as a psychological asset in ideological warfare. The third secret became the most controversial. In 2000, the Vatican finally released a text claiming it described a vision of a bishop in white struck down by soldiers, widely interpreted as a prophecy of the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But discrepancies remain. Independent accounts of Sister Lucia, the surviving child visionary, mention far more detail than the official version included. Some early testimonies spoke of catastrophic global upheaval and internal crises within the Church itself. These details are absent from the published text. Critics argue that the Vatican released only a portion of the secret, withholding elements that predicted corruption and collapse within its own hierarchy. Even more tantalizing are hints of a fourth secret, inkinkt. In correspondence from the 1940s preserved in Vatican files but never fully released, references appear to an additional prophecy describing the internal ruin of authority and the exposure of hidden crimes. Though fragmentary, these lines eerily foreshadow the scandals of financial corruption and abuse that would shake the Church in later decades. If such a text exists, it would explain why the Vatican has remained so reluctant to disclose everything about Fatima. Scientific investigations into the so-called miracle of the sun have raised additional mysteries. Meteorological records show no unusual solar activity on October 13, 1917. Astronomers across Europe reported nothing unusual, yet thousands on the ground swore they saw the sun dance. Some researchers propose atmospheric optics or mass psychological suggestion, but documents in the Vatican archives include weather reports and correspondence indicating that church officials anticipated extraordinary signs months in advance. This raises the disturbing possibility that the phenomenon was orchestrated, or at least expected, as part of a strategy to validate the children's visions. Multispectral imaging of surviving handwritten testimonies has revealed faint erasures where words were changed. In one case, the children's description of a lady in white was altered to the Lady of the Rosary. In another, the phrase a great light was edited into a light from heaven. Such changes seem minor, but they redirect interpretation toward established Catholic devotion and away from ambiguous descriptions. They also demonstrate how the Vatican exercised editorial control from the very beginning. The forbidden truth of Fatima is not simply whether the visions were genuine, it is how they were used. Prophecy became policy. Apparitions became ammunition in ideological battles. The faithful prayed to prevent Russia's errors, while strategists saw an opportunity to mobilize millions under the banner of religious destiny. Fatima was less about foretelling the future than about shaping it. The motif of the locked door here becomes the sealed envelope. The children wrote down the secrets. Those pages were placed in Vatican safes. For decades, popes read them in private while the public speculated wildly. Each decision to release or not release content was calculated, its timing chosen to influence events. In 1942, the second secret was promoted heavily, just as the Soviet Union was consolidating power in Eastern Europe. In 2000, the third secret was published, carefully interpreted as referring to John Paul II's survival, framing it as proof of divine protection for the papacy at the dawn of a new millennium. Each disclosure was less about transparency and more about narrative control. Fatima thus stands as a paradox. To believers, it is one of the most important Marian apparitions in history. To skeptics, it is a carefully managed myth. To the Vatican, it is both, a spiritual event with political utility. And within the Vatican Secret Archives lie the drafts, edits, and correspondence that show just how carefully the story was constructed. As we close this part of the labyrinth, one haunting question remains. If Fatima was shaped so deliberately, how many other miracles or visions have been similarly edited, withheld, or manufactured? And if the Church could manipulate something as sacred as prophecy, what does this reveal about its handling of human consciousness itself? Visions, near-death experiences, and mystical states that blur the line between science and faith? Each disclosure of Fatima was less about revelation than about control. Prophecy turned into policy, vision transformed into strategy. If the Church could shape the story of the sun itself, then we must ask, what else has it shaped, hidden, or engineered? The answer may lie in another corner of the Vatican archives, far from Marian apparitions, where files describe not visions of children, but experiments on consciousness itself. Here we leave the realm of prophecy and enter the domain of science. Studies of near-death experiences, manipulated mystical states, and the unsettling possibility that spiritual encounters can be induced, measured, and controlled. This is the shadowy territory of Project Lucifer, the Vatican's secret exploration of the science of the soul. In the late 1970s, the Vatican publicly announced a new initiative, the Vatican Observatory Research Group. To the outside world, it appeared as a gesture of openness, a continuation of the Church's long-standing interest in astronomy and calendar calculation. Yet hidden within the archives is evidence that the observatory was also the public face of something far more secretive. Internally, some files refer to it by another name, Project Lucifer. The word Lucifer, meaning light bringer, has long carried dual meanings, the morning star, but also the fallen angel. In this context, it symbolized both illumination and danger. Project Lucifer was less concerned with the stars above and more with the mysteries within, the nature of human consciousness, the survival of the soul, and the possibility of manipulating religious experience with scientific means. Reports preserved in the archives describe a rise in unusual phenomena during the mid-20th century. Priests and investigators recorded thousands of testimonies of near-death experiences, visions of saints, apparitions of deceased relatives, and mystical encounters. Instead of dismissing these as superstition, Vatican officials took them seriously. Internal memoranda reveal a systematic program to collect and analyze data, drawing on neurologists, psychologists, and even physicists from universities in Europe and America. Some of the findings were remarkable. Patients who had been clinically dead for several minutes reported experiences with astonishing consistency. Journeys through tunnels of light, encounters with beings of overwhelming presence, a life review flashing in moments. More disturbingly, some returned with knowledge of events that occurred far away from their hospital beds, knowledge later verified. Such accounts could not easily be explained by brain function shutting down. Project Lucifer sought to probe deeper. Experimental notes, fragments of which have surfaced through multispectral imaging of Vatican documents, describe controlled attempts to induce similar states in volunteers. Electromagnetic fields targeted at specific regions of the brain produced sensations of presence, visions of light, even auditory experiences of voices. In other experiments, psychoactive compounds were administered under strict observation, resulting in encounters indistinguishable from traditional mystical visions. The stated aim was to separate authentic divine experiences from artificial ones. But the applications were clear. If religious experiences could be induced, they could also be controlled. The Vatican archives contain references to Tasche's Consciousness Anomalies Task Force, a small body of clergy scientists tasked with cataloguing these phenomena. One report, dated 1982, mentions non-local awareness, the ability of subjects to perceive information beyond their immediate senses. Another describes statistical anomalies in experiments involving prayer groups, where measurable changes in biological markers occurred in patients who were unaware they were being prayed for. To scientists, such results suggested unexplained correlations. To the Vatican, they represented both proof and peril. The forbidden truth here is staggering. The Vatican possessed data suggesting that consciousness may not be confined to the brain. If true, it would validate ancient teachings about the soul, but it would also destabilize the authority of the Church, for if individuals could directly access transcendent states, what need would there be for institutional mediation? Thus, Project Lucifer's discoveries were not shared widely but locked away, preserved as strategic knowledge rather than spiritual gift. technological analysis of the archival files hints at deliberate concealment. Infrared imaging of certain documents shows overwritten annotations, suggesting original findings were softened before being filed. In one case, references to evidence of survival after death were erased and replaced with unexplained persistence of awareness. The careful wording reflects an effort to control not only what was preserved, but how it might one day be interpreted. There are also indications that Project Lucifer did not operate in isolation. References appear to cooperation with external agencies, government programs in the United States and Soviet Union that also explored psychic phenomena during the Cold War. Declassified CIA files confirm extensive research into remote viewing and telepathy during this period. It is not difficult to imagine that information flowed quietly between these programs and the Vatican, each wary of public scandal but unwilling to ignore the potential of such discoveries. The motif of the locked door here becomes the laboratory chamber. Within it, human subjects encountered visions indistinguishable from divine revelation, some natural, some engineered. The line between miracle and manipulation blurred. Was a vision of the Virgin the gift of heaven or the product of electromagnetic suggestion? Was a near-death encounter with light proof of the soul's survival or a neurological artifact? The archive does not answer. It simply records both possibilities and hides them from the faithful. The secrecy reflects a deeper dilemma. If consciousness truly extends beyond the body, then the materialist foundation of modern science is incomplete. If visions can be induced technologically, then the boundary between authentic and artificial spirituality collapses. Either way, revelation becomes destabilizing. The findings of Project Lucifer remain locked, accessible only to archivists and officials who judge the world unready. The forbidden truth of Project Lucifer is not merely that the Vatican studied these mysteries. It is that they may have confirmed, at least in part, what religions have claimed for millennia, that consciousness is more than biology, that the soul persists beyond death. But instead of proclaiming this, the Church chose to conceal it, preserving the discovery as a form of institutional power. This concealment connects seamlessly with the broader pattern of the archives. Just as Galileo's heliocentric observations were suppressed, just as the Templar legacy was absorbed, just as Fatima's prophecies were edited, so too were these findings about human consciousness hidden. Information was not destroyed. It was curated, reshaped, and stored for strategic use. As we prepare to leave this chamber of the archive, one realization lingers. The manipulation of consciousness may be the most profound form of control. To guide belief at its root, to trigger visions or silence them, is to control not only history, but the inner life of humanity. And so, we move to the next corridor of the labyrinth, where the evidence of suppression takes a more material form. Here, ink is scraped from parchment, manuscripts overwritten, whole narratives erased. If Project Lucifer reveals how the Vatican studied the soul, the next part shows how it has rewritten the page of history itself. In the hushed vaults of the Vatican Secret Archives, manuscripts line the shelves like silent witnesses. To the untrained eye, they appear intact, vellum pages bound in leather, carefully catalogued, centuries preserved. But closer study reveals a more troubling reality. Many of these texts are not pristine records of the past, but palimpsests, pages scraped, erased, and overwritten. The Vatican's archives are not simply a collection of documents, they are a labyrinth of edited memory, where absence itself becomes evidence of control. The practice of erasure was common in the medieval world, born partly of necessity. Parchment was costly, and scribes often reused it. But in the Vatican's holdings, the patterns go beyond economics. Entire passages of politically sensitive material are missing, while adjacent theological writings remain untouched. Ink fades at suspicious intervals, replaced by carefully aligned new text. The handwriting changes, sometimes abruptly, suggesting later interventions. In these cases, erasure is not accidental but deliberate. One of the most striking examples involves the records of the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418. This council ended the Western Schism when multiple men claimed to be pope simultaneously. Official Vatican versions of the proceedings emphasize unity and divine order. Yet scholars using multispectral imaging on certain council documents have uncovered faint undertexts showing details of bitter negotiations, backroom deals with monarchs, and financial concessions to secure loyalty. These erased passages challenge the triumphal narrative promoted for centuries. The story we inherited, of a church restored by consensus, was manufactured in ink. Inquisitorial records show similar manipulation. Files on heresy trials are often incomplete, with gaps precisely where evidence of coerced confessions or inconsistencies should appear. Surviving fragments discovered in regional archives sometimes contradict the Vatican's official versions preserved in Rome. In one case, a 16th century astronomer's trial transcript in the Vatican ends abruptly after his recantation. A duplicate copy in a provincial collection, however, includes additional testimony where the accused described astronomical phenomena supporting heliocentrism. The Vatican version excluded this detail, effectively erasing part of the intellectual struggle from history. Financial ledgers reveal the same pattern. Account books from the 14th and 15th centuries display erasures in margins where payments to certain families disappear, only to reappear under different names later. Ultraviolet scans of these ledgers show faint traces of original entries, suggesting that papal finances were deliberately rewritten to disguise debts or alliances. The effect was to maintain a polished image of stability while concealing the true entanglements of papal power. Even papal bulls, the authoritative decrees sealed with lead, exist in multiple versions. In some, the language is uncompromising. In others, softened. Scholars comparing different copies have found that more favourable versions were preserved in the Vatican, while harsher or contradictory versions were allowed to vanish. The archive thus functions not merely as memory, but as editor, producing the most advantageous draft of history. Modern technology has exposed these manipulations with startling clarity. Multispectral imaging, which uses different wavelengths of light to reveal erased text, has uncovered hidden lines in dozens of Vatican manuscripts. In one case, a 9th century theological treatise revealed undertexts describing contact with Islamic scholars in Spain, evidence of dialogue that contradicts the later narrative of strict division between faiths. Another revealed early experiments with medicinal herbs, suggesting practical knowledge later dismissed as superstition. These rediscovered layers show that the Church did not simply lose documents, it curated reality by obscuring certain parts of it. The motif of the locked door here becomes the erased line itself, a missing sentence, a scraped name, a blank page. Each functions as a barrier no less real than iron gates. What the archive presents as silence is in fact an act of control. To erase is to decide not only what is forgotten, but how the future will remember. The forbidden truth of these erasures is that our history has been filtered through centuries of editing. We believe we know the past because manuscripts survive, yet those manuscripts may be versions carefully shaped to reinforce papal supremacy. Where we expect an impartial record, we find a curated narrative. Where we hope for continuity, we find gaps. And this is not only a medieval phenomenon. Even in the modern era, editing persists. Reports from the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s exist in multiple drafts. Some passages advocating radical transparency never appear in the final versions stored in the archives. Testimonies of participants suggest deliberate redaction, consistent with the institution's centuries-old practice of shaping memory. Scholars who have glimpsed restricted catalogues note tantalizing titles of documents that do not appear in public indices. Their very existence is hidden, locked away by omission. These missing references suggest that erasure continues not only on parchment, but in the metadata of the archive itself. The implications are profound. If the past can be rewritten through careful erasure, then history as we know it is less fact than construction. The archive does not passively preserve, it actively engineers what we are allowed to know. In every scraped word and missing record lies the hand of control. As the tools of imaging grow more advanced, the Vatican faces a paradox. Technologies like X-ray fluorescence and machine learning make it harder to conceal what was once invisible. Scholars outside the Church are beginning to reconstruct erased texts, piecing together what centuries of secrecy attempted to destroy. The locked door of the archive is no longer absolute. Light now passes through parchment as surely as it passes through stone. Yet even as modern science exposes hidden layers, the Vatican adapts. Where once it relied on scraping ink from vellum, it now turns to digital curation, where omissions leave no visible trace. The next chamber of our journey leads us into this new era, an age when the locked door no longer looks like a heavy vault, but like a glowing computer screen. Here transparency itself becomes the illusion. It was hailed as an act of unprecedented transparency. In 2017, Pope Francis announced the Vatican's most ambitious project in centuries, the digitization of its vast archives. For the first time, the world's scholars would gain access to treasures previously restricted by time, space, and secrecy. Ancient papal bulls, medieval maps, inquisitorial records, all made accessible through a click, a screen, a search. It was described as a revolution of openness, the transformation of the most secretive archive into the people's library. But those who looked closer began to notice oddities. Files that should have been complete appeared strangely truncated. References present in older catalogues no longer matched the digital versions. Cross-references dissolved. And when advanced text analysis systems were turned loose on the data, a disturbing pattern emerged. Entire passages had been redacted not by human hand, but by machine. Computer scientists working with the project detected embedded code hidden in the metadata. The system was programmed to filter information based on keywords, to rewrite access dynamically depending on who was searching. A researcher in Rome might see one version of a text, another in London, a subtly different one. What appeared to be complete access was in fact curated, manipulated by algorithms invisible to the user. The archive had not grown more open, it had grown more efficient at control. Imagine an inquisitor of the 17th century, painstakingly striking out forbidden lines with a quill. Now replace him with code, capable of hiding millions of words in an instant, erasing not only text, but the very awareness that something was missing. The locked door had become a digital interface, polished and glowing, yet just as impenetrable. The archive's digitization project thus represents a paradox. Transparency was the promise, illusion was the reality. Instead of dusty shelves behind iron locks, researchers encountered sleek portals whose gates were hidden within code. Scholars would leave convinced they had seen everything, unaware that the most dangerous passages had never even appeared on their screens. The forbidden truth here is not about any single document, it is about the method. For centuries, secrecy relied on stone walls and archivists' oaths. Now, secrecy has adapted to the digital age, embedding itself within the very systems that claim to liberate knowledge. A page hidden is obvious, an algorithmic omission is invisible, and yet even algorithms leave traces. Artificial intelligence trained to find patterns began to detect anomalies in language, correlations across centuries that suggested entire narratives had been smoothed, redacted, rewritten. Some fragments implied a continuity of suppressed knowledge, mathematical formulas centuries ahead of their time, astronomical data inconsistent with medieval cosmology, financial records linking papal coffers to empires long fallen. The implications were staggering. The Vatican had not merely hidden inconvenient truths, it had actively sculpted the memory of Western civilization. The motif of the locked door now becomes a screen, smooth, glowing, promising clarity, yet concealing as much as it reveals. Behind it, the archive continues its ancient rhythm of curation, now augmented by machines. The guardians are no longer only archivists in shadow, but lines of code that enforce silence with perfect obedience. As we step away from this digital mirage, we are left with a haunting realization. The age of parchment and vaults is ending, but the age of invisible censorship is only beginning. And if the Vatican has perfected this art, what does it mean for every other institution now digitizing its past? The archive whispers in a new tongue, not Latin, but algorithm, and its secrets are no less forbidden. When people imagine the Vatican Secret Archives, they think of locked vaults, heavy iron doors, and dusty tomes stacked high on endless shelves. Yet behind this physical architecture lies something more subtle, the human element. The archives are not guarded by machines alone, but by archivists, men and women who act as the living gatekeepers of memory. Their presence is quieter than the thunder of decrees or the grandeur of papal ceremonies, but without them, the machinery of secrecy would collapse. The rules that shape their role are strict, codified over centuries. Every archivist swears an oath of secrecy that binds them for life. They are permitted to catalogue, preserve, and repair, but never to disclose. A scholar may petition access, but the archivist decides whether the request will even be processed. The archivist is both servant and warden, custodian and censor. Within their silence lies the power to determine what fragments of history survive in the light and what remains entombed in shadow. Occasionally, rare glimpses into their world have surfaced. Letters written by former archivists, published long after their deaths, describe the atmosphere of the vaults. One called the archives a city beneath the city, where corridors twist like streets and shelves rise like walls. Another spoke of the unbearable weight of paper, of knowing that in their hands lay truths that could unravel reputations and alter the course of nations. These testimonies, though scarce, remind us that secrecy is not abstract. It is lived by people who feel its weight every day. Some archivists have left coded hints in their catalogues, subtle references pointing scholars toward materials otherwise overlooked. Others have admitted, quietly and at personal risk, that documents have been withheld not because of fragility, but because of their content. Stories circulate of archivists who try to smuggle information out, photocopies slipped into pockets, microfilms hidden in clothing. A few succeeded, leaking material that later became public. Others vanished from employment records, their fate unknown. The archives hold documents, but they also hold the traces of those who kept them. Scientific methods have shed light on their labour. Forensic analysis of catalogues shows layers of annotation written in different hands across centuries. In some cases, earlier entries are crossed out, replaced with new ones, suggesting intentional concealment. Spectral imaging of ink reveals overwritten words, perhaps names of documents deliberately obscured. These traces show how archivists were not only passive guardians, but active participants in shaping what could be known. The human cost of secrecy appears in diaries and correspondence. One archivist in the 19th century wrote of the torment of dual loyalty, loyalty to truth and loyalty to the institution. Another confessed in private notes that he sometimes wept while handling documents that exposed centuries of corruption, knowing he would never be allowed to speak of them. These voices, faint as they are, echo the paradox at the heart of the archives. The guardians themselves are prisoners of the secrecy they maintain. The motif of the locked door here becomes the archivist's silence. Each archivist is a living door, deciding whether to open or close, to admit or deny. Their discretion is as impenetrable as stone, and unlike locks of iron, this silence is harder to breach because it is bound not only by oath, but by conscience, fear, and faith. One of the most haunting elements is the generational continuity. The archives are not static, they are inherited. Archivists pass down their methods, their unwritten rules, their silences. Families of Roman origin have supplied archivists for generations, creating dynasties of secrecy. The result is a culture where concealment is tradition, reinforced not only by papal authority, but by social expectation. To break silence would be to betray not just the institution, but one's own lineage. Yet cracks appear. In the 20th century, as pressure for transparency grew, archivists faced increasing demands to open the vaults. Some resisted fiercely, citing fragility of documents. Others allowed limited glimpses. But even then, their control remained decisive. What scholars saw was filtered, curated, and rationed. In practice, archivists acted as editors of history, ensuring that only fragments aligning with institutional narratives were released. The forbidden truth of the archivists is that history is mediated not only by popes and theologians, but by anonymous custodians whose choices remain invisible. A decision not to log a document, not to permit an entry, not to repair a fragile manuscript, each is an act of shaping memory. Scholars often assume the archives are neutral. In reality, they are living systems of judgment, discretion, and omission. Modern science has begun to expose their invisible hand. Linguistic analysis of catalogue entries reveals patterns of censorship, with certain terms, heresy, corruption, treasure, disappearing from indices after certain centuries. Imaging of restricted shelves shows materials misfiled deliberately, their true subjects hidden behind misleading titles. These findings confirm what scholars have long suspected. Archivists did not merely preserve, they curated reality. And so, the echoes of the archivists resound in every locked case, every missing record, every altered line. They remind us that secrecy is not an abstract machine but a human practice, sustained by countless hands that quietly obeyed, resisted, or questioned. The archivists are the invisible authors of history, their silence as powerful as any papal decree. As we move deeper into the labyrinth, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The Vatican's archives are not only a repository of knowledge, but a system of control, an interlocking machine that gathers, edits, conceals, and releases information with precision. To understand how the archivists fit into this machinery, we must now step back and view the system as a whole. What emerges is not random concealment, but a deliberate architecture, the machinery of control itself. Step back from the dim vaults of parchment and consider the pattern as a whole. For 8 centuries, the Vatican Secret Archives have not merely stored documents, they have engineered memory. Each fragment of evidence, whether a papal bull, a redacted trial transcript, a financial ledger, or a prophetic vision, fits into a larger architecture of control. The archive is less a library than a machine, humming across centuries, refining the art of secrecy with every turn of history. The mechanism is simple yet devastatingly effective. Gather, select, conceal, release. First, the gathering, correspondence from kings, contracts with bankers, confessions of heretics, revelations of visionaries. Then the selection, what to preserve, what to discard, what to alter. Next, the concealment, locked doors, oaths of silence, sealed envelopes. Finally, the release, timed and edited to shape public perception, to recast the past in service of the present. Consider how this machine operated across different eras. In the 14th century, it absorbed the financial networks of the Templars. In the 17th, it suppressed heliocentric astronomy to preserve cosmic hierarchy. In the 20th, it laundered gold for collapsing regimes, while mobilizing prophecies like Fatima against communism. In the 21st, it cloaks itself in the glow of digitization, promising access while algorithmically withholding. The continuity is unmistakable. This is not accident, but design. The forbidden truth revealed by the archive is not any single scandal, but the recognition of a system, a machinery that survives rulers, revolutions, and even technologies. Popes die, kingdoms fall, wars erupt and subside. Yet the archive endures, adjusting its gears, reshaping its methods, ever refining its grip on knowledge. The motif of the locked door here becomes a vast labyrinth of interlocking gears. Each decree, each erasure, each secret prophecy is a cog turning another, all synchronized toward one purpose: control of narrative. The machinery is not visible when viewed in fragments, but from above, its design becomes clear. And what makes the machine so powerful is that it operates in plain sight. Scholars enter reading rooms, journalists speculate, pilgrims walk the marble piazzas. The archive is no myth. It is real, physical, immense. Its secrecy is legitimized by ritual, its control disguised as protection, its omissions justified as prudence. In this way, the machine remains invisible precisely because it is everywhere. If history is memory, then the Vatican has built the most enduring memory machine in existence. It decides what humanity remembers and what it forgets, which truths become legends and which vanish into silence. And so the question grows sharper. If the machinery of control has survived so long, what might it still be hiding? What forbidden futures lie sealed in its vaults, waiting for a moment when their release could change the world itself? The gears continue to turn. But ahead, in the next chamber of our journey, we step away from the known patterns and peer into speculation. What lies hidden still? Prophecies, technologies, truths too dangerous to release. The machinery has concealed them for centuries, but perhaps the faint hum of its cogs allows us to imagine what has yet to be revealed. The shelves of the Vatican Secret Archives stretch beyond sight, but it is not only the past they conceal. In the whispered corridors of speculation, one begins to sense that the vaults may also hold fragments of futures never allowed to emerge. Prophecies, suppressed inventions, untested knowledge. Threads that, if woven into the fabric of our world, could alter the course of civilization. Among the most tantalizing are the prophecies. Beyond Fatima's veiled warnings lie other texts, apocryphal revelations attributed to mystics, seers, and saints, most never acknowledged publicly. Some hint at cyclical catastrophes, resets of history that echo flood myths and firestorms of earlier ages. Others speak of a time when the Church itself would be stripped bare, its authority undone not by enemies without, but by truth from within. The archive guards these writings not because they are false, but because their release could destabilize belief, accelerating crises already underway. Then there are the technological manuscripts, drawings, notes, experiments that seem centuries ahead of their time. Reports from scholars who gained rare glimpses speak of sketches resembling flying machines, coded treatises on energy drawn from crystalline structures, alchemical formulas hinting at medicines unknown to modern pharmacology. Were these the fantasies of medieval dreamers, or evidence of lost knowledge recovered and then suppressed? The machinery of control, so carefully tuned, ensures we may never know. Financial records too may point toward forbidden futures. Consider the continuity of wealth traced from Templar networks to Vatican banking, from Nazi gold to Cold War covert funds. If the archive preserves unbroken chains of transactions, it may reveal not only hidden pasts, but ongoing obligations, alliances that extend into our present financial systems. The future, in such a case, is already mortgaged by debts written in parchment centuries ago. Most haunting are the files of Project Lucifer and its successors. If consciousness survives death, if human potential includes non-local awareness, if visions can be engineered, then the boundaries of human nature itself are negotiable. To reveal such truths openly would ignite revolutions in science, religion, and society. But to conceal them ensures that such futures remain locked, available only to those who hold the keys. The motif of the locked door here transforms into a sealed chest of possibility. We are not merely denied knowledge of what was, we are denied what could be. The archive functions as a dam, holding back floods of truths that might wash away the structures of authority. Yet the longer water presses against stone, the more powerful the deluge when the dam finally cracks. The forbidden futures of the Vatican Secret Archives are not science fiction. They are the logical continuation of patterns already seen: selective revelation, curated miracles, hidden finances, suppressed discoveries. If history has been engineered, why not destiny? If the past can be rewritten, why not the future withheld? And so, as we near the end of this journey, we confront a haunting possibility that humanity itself has been shaped not only by the truths it has known, but by the futures it has been denied. Futures still lying silent, ink pressed against vellum, sealed with golden wax in the labyrinth of the Vatican. But the machine of secrecy cannot run forever. The gears wear, the ink fades, the seals crack. What happens when the weight of centuries grows too heavy, when the machinery falters, when the forbidden truths themselves demand to be known? That question leads us into the final chamber of our journey, the cycle of secrecy itself. Morning light filters through the narrow windows of the Vatican, illuminating specks of dust that swirl like ancient memories suspended in air. Deep within the secret archives, archivists continue their quiet ritual, cataloguing, sealing, denying, releasing. Centuries pass, yet the rhythm remains unchanged. Knowledge enters, is sifted, altered, concealed. Only fragments emerge, carefully chosen, carefully timed. This is the cycle of secrecy. It is older than any single pope, older than the marble walls of the Vatican itself. It is the recognition that information is power, that truth can destabilize as easily as it can enlighten, that civilization often prefers comforting illusions to disquieting realities. And so the archivists persist, guardians of a paradox, preserving memory by erasing it, protecting faith by suppressing knowledge, maintaining order by withholding truth. We have traced this cycle through the centuries, from the missing centuries of medieval Europe to Galileo's silenced telescope, from the disappearance of the Templars to the laundering of Nazi gold, from visions at Fatima to experiments in consciousness, from ink scraped from parchment to code that edits text before our eyes. Each chapter reveals the same pattern: concealment followed by selective revelation, denial followed by reluctant admission, myth woven into history until the line disappears. But the cycle is not theirs alone, it reflects something within us as well. Humanity demands stability, certainty, coherence. We ask institutions to filter chaos into order, to bear the burden of truths we fear might unravel us. We resent secrecy, yet we rely on it. We condemn the locked door, even as we sleep more soundly knowing some terrors remain behind it. The forbidden truths of the Vatican Secret Archives are not just theirs to hold, they are ours to confront or to avoid. The motif of the locked door returns one last time. It is not only a barrier of stone and iron in Rome, it is a door within our own minds, closing upon uncomfortable knowledge, sealing away questions that might unsettle the fragile stories we tell ourselves. Each of us carries a fragment of the archive, choosing which truths to remember and which to erase. As we stand at the threshold of this cycle, we must ask, what happens when the weight of centuries grows too great for secrecy to bear? What happens when digital cracks allow hidden manuscripts to surface? When whistleblowers expose ledgers? When imaging reveals erased words? When forgotten prophecies resurface? Perhaps then the archive will open, not by the will of its guardians, but by the inevitability of truth pressing outward. Until that day, the cycle continues. Documents sealed, scholars denied, secrets whispered in shadows. The Vatican Secret Archives endure as the most enduring monument to controlled memory, their shelves echoing with silence as potent as any sermon. And yet, even now, the light shifts across those narrow windows. Dust swirls, shelves creak, parchments breathe. Somewhere in the darkness, a golden seal softens with age. Somewhere, an archivist hesitates before turning the key. Somewhere, the cycle begins to falter. Tonight we close the door once more. But remember, it was never truly locked against us. It waits, patient, heavy with forbidden truths, echoing with centuries of silence. And one day perhaps it will open. If these stories stir your curiosity, if they whisper to you as the vaults whisper to me, consider subscribing and sharing this journey. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and at what hour do these echoes reach you?